I found a VHS tape in my basement, and now something is following me. I found the VHS tape in a dusty, forgotten box in the basement of my old rental house. The basement was a mess, filled with the debris of past tenants, rusty tools, broken furniture, and old electronics piled high in every corner. I'd avoided cleaning it out for the entire year I'd lived there, but after my landlord told me the pipes needed inspecting, I had no choice. I spent an afternoon moving old boxes, clearing a path to the walls when I stumbled upon the tape. It was unremarkable, no label, no markings, just a plain black cassette covered in dust. My fingers tingled when I touched it, and for a moment I considered tossing it. I don't know why, but something about it made me uneasy. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and instead of throwing it away, I brought it upstairs. There was one problem. I didn't own a VHS player, and I hadn't watched a tape in years. But for some reason I felt compelled to see what was on it. The next day, I drove to a local thrift shop and found an old VHS player for cheap. After a little work getting it hooked up to my TV, I inserted the tape, unsure of what to expect. The screen flickered for a moment before settling into grainy footage. At first, the image was hard to make out, just shaky camera work, like someone was filming while walking. Slowly, the picture became clearer, revealing an old, dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere. The roof sagged, the windows were dark and empty, and the whole place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I was already feeling unsettled when the footage suddenly cut out. The screen went black for a full minute. I thought maybe the tape was damaged, but just as I was about to eject it, the picture returned. This time, the camera was inside the house, moving through dusty, decaying rooms. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked under the camera's weight. There was no sound, just the eerie silence of the house. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the house itself was watching me, as if something terrible had happened there. The camera moved slowly, deliberately, as if the person holding it was searching for something. It stopped in front of a door that looked ordinary, but, for some reason, made my stomach twist into knots. The door creaked open, revealing a small, empty room. The camera panned across the room, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I saw the figure. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall, thin figure. Its limbs were long and gangly, its body bent at strange angles like it wasn't fully human. I couldn't make out any features. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. Even though I was watching through a screen, I had the unmistakable sensation that the figure was aware of me, watching me as I watched it. The camera lingered on the figure for a few seconds, then the screen abruptly cut to black again. This time the tape ended for good. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, trying to process what I had just seen. The whole thing had been unsettling, creepy even, but it was just a tape. It couldn't hurt me, right? That's what I told myself anyway. But that night, everything changed, and I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from the tape. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a weird old recording. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was irrational, I knew that. But when I finally drifted off around 2 a.m., I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed. The next day, I tried to forget about the tape. I went to work, tried to focus, but the memory of that shadowy figure lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I got home that evening, I headed down to the basement to finish clearing out the junk for the plumber. But as soon as I stepped onto the basement stairs, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I don't know how to explain it, but the air felt different, heavier, colder. That's when I noticed something strange. The box where I'd found the tape, it was gone.
At first, I thought I'd moved it without remembering, but I searched the entire basement and couldn't find it anywhere. The tape was still upstairs in the player, but the box it came from had vanished. I tried to brush it off, and maybe I'd thrown it out by accident, or maybe the landlord had taken it when I wasn't home, but something felt off. Later that night, I was watching TV when I heard it. A thump. Soft at first, then louder. It was coming from the basement.
I muted the TV, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time closer. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, and for a moment I considered locking it and pretending I hadn't heard anything, but the noise was getting louder, more persistent. I slowly opened the door and shined the flashlight down the stairs. The basement was empty. The sound had stopped. I stood there for a few moments, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house was silent. I shut the door and went back to the couch, trying to calm down. Maybe I was just on edge from the tape. That's what I told myself. But then, around midnight, the thumping started again. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, each impact vibrating through the walls. I sat frozen on the couch, my heart pounding in time with the noise. It was coming from the basement again. Whatever had made the sound earlier wasn't gone. It had returned. I grabbed my flashlight, my pulse racing as I debated what to do. Something deep inside told me to ignore it, to lock the basement door and leave it for morning. But my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the image of that figure on the VHS tape, the long limbs, the shadowy presence, and I wondered if I'd disturbed something by watching it. Had I drawn something to me? I took a deep breath and stood, flashlight in hand, creeping toward the basement door. My palms were sweaty, and every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I listened. The thumping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. With a shaky hand, I turned the knob and opened the door. I aimed the flashlight down the stairs, half expecting to see something standing at the bottom, but the beam illuminated only the empty concrete floor. Still the thumping persisted, and I could feel it now, a vibration beneath my feet.
I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was darker than usual, the single bulb in the ceiling barely cutting through the shadows. As I reached the bottom, the sound suddenly stopped. I stood there, flashlight scanning the cluttered room, searching for the source of the noise, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw it. A corner of the wall near the back of the basement had been disturbed. A section of the concrete had been cracked, the edges jagged and uneven, like something had been trying to break through from the other side. My breath hitched as I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my grip.
The crack was about the size of a fist, but it wasn't the crack itself that terrified me. It was what was inside. Through the opening, I could see something moving, not large, but shifting, like a mass of dark tendrils squirming in the space between the walls. I stepped back, my heart hammering, as the tendrils seemed to pulse, pressing against the crack, trying to push through. Suddenly the thumping returned, this time louder, as if it were right beside me. The vibration shook the floor beneath my feet, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The tendrils writhed faster, more violently, as if whatever was behind the wall was fighting to break free. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I backed away, my eyes glued to the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The thumping continued, but now it felt like it was in the walls, reverberating through the house, growing stronger with each passing second. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no service, nothing. Panic set in as the noise grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't stay in the house. Whatever was behind that wall was getting closer, and I didn't want to be around when it broke through. I ran to the front door, flung it open, and sprinted to my car. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, the tires screeching as I sped down the street. In the rearview mirror, I could see the house fading into the distance, the dark shape of it looming like a shadow at the edge of my vision. But the noise, the thumping, it hadn't stopped. It was inside the car now, vibrating through the dashboard, through the seat, through my bones. I screamed, slamming on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The thumping grew louder, faster, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something in the back seat. Something long and thin, twisted into unnatural shapes. I threw open the car door and stumbled out, the cold pavement rough against my hands and knees as I collapsed on the side of the road. The thumping stopped. Silence pressed in around me, suffocating as I lay there gasping for breath. I looked back at the car, half expecting to see the thing from the tape, the figure with the long limbs, the shadowy presence. But there was nothing there. Just my car idling quietly in the middle of the road, the headlights cutting through the dark. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't go back to the house, not after what I'd seen. But where could I go? I had no answers, no explanation for what was happening, and no way of knowing how to stop it. I stumbled down the road, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the events of the past few days. The VHS tape, the figure, the basement. None of it made any sense. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined it all?
Then from behind me I heard a familiar sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was following me.
I stood frozen in the middle of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The thumping noise was unmistakable, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just following me, it was chasing me. My body screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, terror gripping me so tightly that I could barely think straight.
Thump, thump, thump.
I turned slowly, dreading what I might see, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty road stretching into the darkness. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, like it was echoing through my skull rather than coming from outside. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of it, but my mind was spinning.
Then something moved in the distance, a shadow, barely visible, flickering at the edge of my vision. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were long and thin, just like the figure I'd seen on the VHS tape. It stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back toward my car, barely able to keep my balance. I had to get away, but I didn't know where to go. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal. The tires squealed as the car shot forward, my headlights cutting through the blackness.
But the thumping didn't stop. It was inside my head now, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I pressed harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't outrun the sound. I don't know how long I drove. Time had become meaningless. All I knew was that the road stretched on forever, and the darkness outside my car seemed to be closing in, suffocating me. The thumping grew louder, until it felt like it was inside the car with me.
I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure sitting in the back seat again. But it was empty. My mind raced with thoughts of what had started all of this, the VHS tape. I needed to get rid of it. I had to destroy it, burn it, whatever it took. Maybe then this nightmare would end.
I swerved off the road, pulling into a secluded gas station, its neon sign flickering in and out of existence. The place looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I yanked the VHS tape out of the player and stumbled out of the car, gripping the tape like it was a live wire. I scanned the area for something, anything, to destroy it with. There was an old, rusted metal trash can near the gas station's entrance. I threw the tape inside, then grabbed a lighter from my pocket. My hands shook as I flicked the lighter to life, the tiny flame casting long shadows over the ground. Without hesitating, I dropped the flame into the trash can. The tape caught fire almost instantly, the plastic melting, the black magnetic tape curling and warping in the heat. I watched as the flames devoured it, hoping, praying that this would end whatever was happening to me. But as the fire burned, I realized something horrifying. The thumping hadn't stopped. In fact, it was getting louder.
Panic surged through me. The tape was gone. There was nothing left but ash. How was the sound still there? I backed away from the burning trash can, my mind racing. Something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just about the tape. I had unleashed something, and now it was coming for me. I jumped back into my car and sped off again, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The thumping was relentless, filling the car, filling my head. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, trying to focus on the road ahead. I needed to think, what had I missed? Why wasn't this over? I had destroyed the tape, but it didn't seem to matter. The figure, the thumping, it was still with me. Then a memory flickered in my mind.
The box.
The box I'd found the tape in, the one that had disappeared from the basement. That was the key. It had to be. Maybe there was more to it. Maybe the tape was just one piece of a larger puzzle. I didn't know for sure, but I had to find out. I turned the car around, heading back toward the house. It was the last place I wanted to be, but I didn't have a choice. I needed to go back to figure out what I had missed. When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed over me like a living thing, its windows dark and hollow. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the basement door, my heart pounding in my ears. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The basement was just as I had left it, dark, cold and silent, but something felt different. The air was heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I stepped down the stairs, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows.
I moved toward the corner where the crack in the wall had been, expecting to see the tendrils writhing behind the concrete. But the crack was gone. The wall was intact, as if nothing had ever broken through it. Confused, I began searching the basement for the box. I tore through old piles of junk, flipped over furniture, but it was nowhere to be found. My frustration grew with each passing second. The thumping in my head was deafening now, and I could barely focus.
Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The box. It was sitting in the middle of the floor, perfectly placed, as if waiting for me.
I approached it slowly, my heart in my throat. I didn't know what I was about to find, but I had no other choice. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside was another VHS tape, but this one had a label. Scrawled across it, in my sister's handwriting, were the words, "Watch me." I stood there staring at the VHS tape in the box. My sister's handwriting scrawled across the label, "Watch me." My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The thumping in my head hadn't stopped, and now this, another tape. It wasn't just about the figure on the first tape. My sister was somehow involved in this, and she had left me a message.
But how? She had disappeared years ago. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to burn this tape like I had the first one. But I knew I couldn't. I needed to know what was on it, what she was trying to tell me. I grabbed the tape and headed upstairs, the thumping in my head intensifying with each step. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the tape into the player. The screen flickered to life, the same grainy quality as the first tape, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next.
The screen showed an old room, one I didn't recognize at first. The camera panned slowly, focusing on the details of the room: faded wallpaper, a broken chair, dust covering every surface. Then I realized it was the basement. My basement. The camera moved to the corner where the crack in the wall had been, zooming in on the space where the tendrils had once writhed. But now there was nothing. The camera lingered on the wall for a moment before it slowly turned to face something else, something that made my blood run cold. A figure tall and thin stood in the middle of the room, its long limbs bent at unnatural angles. It was the same figure from the first tape, but this time it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it began to approach the camera. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the screen as the figure got closer and closer, its shadow stretching across the floor. Suddenly, the screen cut to black. I sat there, trembling, waiting for the next part. Then the image returned, but this time it wasn't the basement on the screen. It was my living room. The camera was moving through my house, just like it had in the basement. My throat tightened as I watched the footage play out in real time. The camera passing by the same furniture I was sitting on. It was as if someone or something was in the house with me, filming this exact moment. The camera continued down the hallway, heading toward the room I was in. My heart pounded in my ears, the thumping noise louder than ever. I wanted to get up, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The camera reached the door to the living room, and the doorknob began to turn. I screamed and threw myself off the couch, the VHS tape still playing, as I grabbed my phone. I had to call someone. But when I looked down, the phone screen was black, dead, just like it had been before. The door to the living room creaked open, and I spun around, expecting to see the figure from the tape standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. I stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with tension, the thumping in my head so loud it was almost unbearable. And then I heard it. A whisper. "Help me!" The voice was faint, barely audible, but I knew it was my sister's. My stomach twisted in knots as I looked around, desperate to figure out where the voice was coming from. "Please, help me." It was louder this time, more urgent. I followed the sound, my pulse racing as I moved toward the basement door. The voice was coming from downstairs. My hands shook as I opened the door, the darkness below beckoning me. The thumping had subsided, replaced by the desperate pleas of my sister. I knew it was a terrible idea to go down there, but I couldn't stop myself. I descended the stairs, my flashlight flickering as I reached the bottom. The basement looked different now. The crack in the wall was back, wider than before, the tendrils inside writhing and pulsing with life. "Help me!" the voice echoed again, this time from behind the wall. I approached the crack cautiously, the tendrils pulling back as if retreating. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the wall. The surface was cold, colder than it should have been, and the sensation sent a jolt through me. Then the wall began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a door formed in the concrete, blending into the wall as if it had always been there. I stumbled back in shock, watching as the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark passageway. "Please, hurry!" My sister's voice came again, from deep within the passage. I had no choice. I had to go in. I stepped through the door, the cold air enveloping me as I moved deeper into the darkness. The walls were narrow, closing in on me with each step, and the air smelled damp and stale. My flashlight flickered, but I pressed on, determined to find her. The passage twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper underground. I lost track of time. Minutes felt like hours, and the further I went, the louder my sister's voice became. Then the passage opened up into a large, cavernous room. My flashlight illuminated the space, revealing something that made my blood run cold.
There, in the center of the room, was a chair. And sitting in the chair was my sister.
She looked just as she had the day she disappeared, her eyes wide with terror, her body bound by thick, black tendrils that writhed and squirmed around her.
"Help me,"
she whispered, her voice barely audible.
I ran to her, but as soon as I touched the tendrils, they tightened their grip, pulling her deeper into the chair. Her eyes filled with panic as she looked at me, pleading silently for me to do something. But before I could react, the thumping returned, louder, more intense than ever. The walls of the cavern began to shake, and from the shadows the figure emerged. It towered over us, its limbs twisting and stretching as it approached.
I turned to run, but the passage had sealed shut behind me. There was no way out. The figure reached for me, its long, thin fingers wrapping around my throat. I gasped for air, the world going dark around me.
The last thing I heard was my sister's voice, soft and distant.
"I'm sorry.